Prejudice is defined as a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. A person can be prejudiced against a particular race, gender, or even a social group. In the southern United States, one of the most predominant prejudices is held against different races, specifically African Americans. With this in mind, I interviewed an individual from the Johnson City area and another from Haywood County, which is just across the North Carolina state line. Please allow me to introduce Betty McCracken and Kathy Whaley. Kathy Whaley was born in 1966 in Johnson City and was the only child of James and Betty Whaley. She attended University High, which at the time was an invitation-only school, until 1983 when she elected to get her GED and attend college here at ETSU. During her college career, she was nominated for the Rhodes Scholarship by Dr. Robert J. Higgs and pursued it up to the regional level. She graduated magna cum laude with a bachelor's degree in English and political science. Kathy went on to attend Clemson University to acquire her master's degree in English and spent a few years working as a media specialist in the local Books-A-Million. For the last 8 years, she has been an English professor here at ETSU. Mrs. Betty McCracken, my grandmother, was born in Haywood County in 1942. She lived with her mother Blanche, her father Clarence, and her brother Hugh. She graduated from Waynesville Township High School in 1960 and went on to work at Sky City and various restaurants, gift shops, and service stations. My mother is the youngest of her 3 daughters, and I am one of several grandchildren. Betty is currently retired with her husband and my grandfather Carl in Waynesville, North Carolina. As a child, do you recall any adult ever discussing prejudice with you? If so, what were you told? Throughout their childhoods, Betty and Kathy were never told outright how to treat others. Betty remembers taking cues from her mother and father on how to interact with others, and of course they treated everyone equally and respectfully. Prejudice was not something that existed inside their household, nor was it really prominent in the community at the time. Kathy had similar thoughts on the matter and added that it seemed to her that prejudice was never about what people were told, but about what was not spoken aloud. She lived in a racially mixed neighborhood from the time she was born, and never treated anyone with discourtesy. She went further to raise the question of what skin color or personal differences had to do with how menacing another person may or may not be. Sometimes people will tell children one thing, but model another. Did you pick up on any unwritten rules from the adults in your life about how to interact with those who were different from you? As for modeling behavior after adults, Betty always observed her mother and father being kind to everyone. She was raised in a Christian home where she was taught from a young age to treat others as she would like to be treated. She said that her mother was especially courteous to everyone, and she always tried to follow that lead. Kathy recalled a time when she was expected to think of black and white people differently in 1974 when she was in the 3rd grade. A teacher's assistant had the students do an exercise with pieces of bubblegum, asking them to divide them however they would between themselves and a white friend. Kathy divided it equally. After that, she was asked to divide the pieces however she would if her friend was black. Again, Kathy divided it equally, but the adult in the situation asked her repeatedly if she was sure that's what she would do. She remembered being really bothered by this and didn't see why it should be divided any differently between one friend or another based on skin color. Can you recall one of the first times that you encountered someone who was different than you? What was your reaction? Kathy emphasized the fact that she had always been around black people and therefore couldn't recall when she had first been around someone who was markedly different than herself. She did mention that in the 80s, social status was rampant, and she remembers encountering several people who thought less of what or who they considered to be lower class at the time. When asked the same question, my grandmother recalled meeting a young man in the 7th grade who had been raised a Mormon. She said he was one of the nicest people she'd come into contact with in a long time, but she remembers thinking it was a little funny that he couldn't drink soft drinks or have anything caffeinated because of his beliefs. She went on to say that her first encounter with someone different was strange, but certainly not bad. Thinking back over your life, can you identify any events that happened on a national or regional level that influenced your thinking about prejudice or about other groups of people in general? Kathy and my grandma both remembered that the most prominent national event was that of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. My grandma thought that the entire situation was sad. The hatred that existed between black people and white people, the struggle that they went through, and the oppression of the South, all of it bothered her. Kathy was very young when Martin Luther King Jr. died, but she remembers the aftermath. In the 70s, racism was still a major part of society, but on a personal level, she upheld the principle of not placing people into groups. Kathy went further to say that political correctness tends to embrace labels, and when the labels go up, the dialogue stops. What about personal events that may have influenced your thinking? On a more personal level, Kathy revisited the bubblegum exercise that I described earlier as one of the most influential events that made her more determined to treat people equally. My grandma told me about a friend she had when she was working at Sky City. This woman was black, and my grandmother would sit with her every evening for dinner. It took a really long time for others to do the same, and this young woman was obviously used to people turning their heads away from her throughout the day. The fact that she was used to it really bothered my grandma, and she became more determined to treat people equally afterwards. What have you told, or what do you plan to tell your child or children about prejudice? If you have no children, what would you say? My grandma always told my mom and my aunts to never look down their noses at anyone. She told me the same when I was a little girl, as well as my cousins, and she taught us to treat others with respect, and is very proud to say that her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren have grown up to be respectful young men and women. Kathy doesn't have children, nor does she intend to, but would tell them to always be inclusive instead of exclusive, always be respectful, and never be discourteous. She would also say that we're all people, and different skin colors do not dictate how people think and feel. She said that there's an attitude of those people that is held by a large part of society today, and until we can get away from that attitude, we're never going to get anywhere. Do you think that the problem of prejudice in the United States has improved, grown worse, or stayed about the same during your lifetime? How have things changed? How have they stayed the same? So, has the prejudice in our country gotten worse over the years? When asked, Kathy and my grandma both thought so. Kathy even went so far as to say that as a society, we've gone backwards. She used the Trayvon Martin case as an example of how the media has been a driving force behind prejudice, emphasizing the fact that the young woman who witnessed the crime was depicted as inarticulate and uneducated by news stations, but seemed the opposite when interviewed after her testimony. She feels that coded language is used so much in various parts of the media that it's making it difficult for individuals to let go of their personal prejudices. Grandma felt that the diversity currently present in our society helps to fuel the fires of hatred between groups. There are differences all around us, and there will always be those select few individuals who will spew nothing but hate and ignorance about what they don't understand. She felt that the media has a hand in making the situations worse too. While they have their jobs to do, they have to take responsibility for their words and not stir up unnecessary disputes. Who do you believe had the most influence on your views about diversity? Family, peers, teachers, the media, religion, or your community? We briefly discussed the various influences that shaped their views on diversity. Kathy looked at this really generally and stated that overall, influence came from everywhere. Family, community, peers, media, teachers, all of these shape your opinion of others in some way over time. Specifically, Kathy felt that when anyone reached college, they would be influenced by ideas that they'd never come across before, or be exposed to things that they didn't agree with. No matter who we are to anyone, we should always watch what we say to others, because even one little thing that we say could change another person's opinion. Grandma looked at this question more personally and said that her family had always been an influence over her. Also, being raised in a Christian home, she would always look to the Bible, which taught her to love others as she loved herself and show love and compassion to everyone. What, if anything, do you believe is your responsibility in combating prejudice? Grandma feels that it's her responsibility to accept how people are and not try to judge them for their differences. In order to try and combat prejudice, we must prevent ourselves from saying or doing hateful things because we should always treat people the way we would like to be treated. Kathy feels like the best thing a person can do to combat prejudice is to get educated. In a national public radio broadcast, she recalls hearing a woman say that the best thing about scrapbooking is that if a bad thing happens, you can just cut it out and forget it happened. But you can't look at just one side of people. You have to look at both sides of the extreme and see the good and bad in everything. Life's not a scrapbook. Grandma added that there are good and bad black people just like there are good and bad white people, and that every person sees things from a different angle. How do you believe that prejudice and discrimination should be handled in the future in the U.S.? Overall, Kathy feels that in order to handle prejudice and discrimination, individuals should acknowledge the differences but not dwell on them. We should look at every angle before making up our minds and, as previously stated, be respectful. We should stop talking about needing a dialogue about race and just sit down and talk instead of dance around the issue. At the same time, the groups suffering because of prejudice need to stop stirring in the issue. For example, individuals in the Black community seeking reparations for their great-grandfather's enslavement and seeking more than might be necessary. We need to keep pushing through and try to help others be more receptive and open-minded. My grandmother thinks that it should be handled on an individual basis as well. Each person should take a look at themselves and realize that no matter what color or gender we are, or whatever differences we have than the person next to us, we all bleed red when we're cut. We need to let go of whatever chip we have on our shoulder because we are all equal in the eyes of God. So what did I learn? Well, I learned that no matter where you are, prejudice will be there. It may not be in your hometown. It wasn't in my grandma's and it wasn't in Kathy's, but eventually you will come into contact with it. There will always be people who fear what they don't understand, and there will always be differences. And even though prejudice can never be eradicated, it can be suppressed. As individuals, we all need to try and see that, yeah, everyone's different, but that doesn't mean they should be mistreated.